What secret could make a man guard a sealed box more fiercely than his own life? Who was the silent woman on board, and why her presence feels so wrong? Welcome to Classic Storytime Hub. This is The Oblong Box by Edgar Allan Poe, a reimagined classic tale retold in English, where love, loss, and deception collide in one of Poe's most chilling maritime mysteries.
I still remember the afternoon I booked my passage from Charleston to New York aboard the packet ship Independence. Captain Hardy commanded her, and she had a reputation for smooth crossings when the sea allowed it. We were scheduled to sail on the 15th of June, weather permitting, and the day before departure I stepped aboard to settle a few personal arrangements in my cabin. The ship was already alive with preparation. Trunks were being hauled across the deck, voices echoed through the narrow corridors, and it quickly became clear that this would be a crowded voyage. There were far more passengers than usual, especially women, which gave the ship an oddly tense, expectant atmosphere. As I scanned the passenger list, familiar names began to appear. Friends, acquaintances, and then one name stopped me cold with genuine pleasure. Cornelius Wyatt. We had studied together years earlier at the university. Back then we were nearly inseparable. Wyatt was an artist, brilliant, restless, and difficult to know fully. He carried that peculiar mixture so often found in gifted minds, a quiet bitterness toward the world, a fragile emotional depth, and sudden bursts of passionate enthusiasm. Yet beneath all of it beat a heart of uncommon loyalty and sincerity. I had never doubted his character. But something about his booking struck me as strange. His name appeared not once, but 3 times, each attached to a separate stateroom. Curious, I read further. Wyatt had reserved passage for himself, his wife, and his 2 sisters. 4 people, 3 cabins. Each stateroom held 2 narrow berths stacked one above the other, hardly spacious but adequate. Adequate enough that 3 cabins made no sense. Under ordinary circumstances, I would have dismissed the detail entirely, but that day my mind was in one of those restless moods, too alert, too eager to find meaning in small things, and so, against my better judgment, I lingered on the mystery. Why the extra room? I entertained a number of ridiculous theories, each more intrusive than the last, and felt mildly ashamed of my own curiosity. It was none of my concern. And yet, the question refused to let go. At last, an obvious answer occurred to me. A servant, of course. I nearly laughed at myself for not seeing it sooner. Feeling satisfied, I returned to the passenger list, only to stop short. There was no servant registered. In fact, the words "and servant" had been written and then deliberately crossed out. That small detail reignited my unease. Well then, I thought, it must be cargo. Something valuable, something Wyatt refused to trust to the ship's hold, something he wanted close, under his own watchful eye. And suddenly I remembered his recent dealings with Nicolino, the Italian art dealer. A painting, perhaps, or several. That explanation finally settled my thoughts. For the moment, at least, my curiosity was appeased. And yet, even then, I could not have imagined how profoundly wrong I was. I already knew Wyatt's 2 sisters well. They were intelligent, graceful, and genuinely pleasant, women who made an impression without effort. His wife, however, was another matter entirely. Their marriage was recent, and I had never seen her. Yet Wyatt had spoken of her often, and always with the same unrestrained fervor that colored everything he loved deeply. According to him, she possessed an almost impossible combination: extraordinary beauty, sharp wit, and refined talent. Listening to him, one might imagine a figure lifted straight from a dream rather than a living woman. Naturally, my curiosity grew, and I found myself eager to finally meet the bride who had inspired such devotion. When I visited the ship on the 14th, Captain Hardy informed me that Wyatt and his family were expected later that same day. I lingered on board longer than necessary, hoping for an introduction, but eventually a polite explanation reached me. Mrs. Wyatt, I was told, was feeling unwell. She would remain ashore and join the ship the following day, just before departure. The next morning, as I made my way from the hotel toward the wharf, I unexpectedly encountered Captain Hardy. He stopped me with an apologetic expression and explained that, owing to circumstances, the Independence would likely be delayed for a day or two. It was a phrase as empty as it was convenient. The wind was strong and favorable, and nothing I could see justified the postponement. I pressed him for details, but none were offered. With no choice, I returned home, forced to endure my impatience in silence. Nearly a week passed before the captain's message finally arrived. I went aboard at once. The ship was alive with motion, passengers crowding the deck, sailors shouting orders, ropes tightening, sails preparing to rise. Everything suggested imminent departure. Not long after my arrival, Wyatt and his party appeared. There they were at last, the two sisters, the bride, and Wyatt himself. He seemed withdrawn, caught in one of those dark, brooding moods that had always been part of his nature. I barely noticed it. I had known him too long to be disturbed by such spells. What did strike me, however, was that he offered no introduction at all. That responsibility fell instead to his sister Marian, whose gentle intelligence shone even in the chaos. With a few hurried words, she performed the courtesy her brother neglected. Mrs. Wyatt stood slightly apart, her face hidden behind a veil. When she lifted it to acknowledge my bow, I was, quite frankly, startled. Not overwhelmed, not enchanted, but genuinely surprised. Still, I might have been far more astonished had I not learned through long acquaintance to treat Wyatt's rhapsodies with a measure of skepticism. When he spoke of beauty, particularly the beauty of women, his imagination tended to escape reality altogether, drifting upward into idealized realms where no mortal face could reasonably follow. And so, though the moment lingered in my mind, I reminded myself that expectation, once inflated, has a way of distorting even the simplest truths. To be honest, I could not persuade myself to see Mrs. Wyatt as beautiful at all. If she was not outright unattractive, she hovered dangerously close to it. Her features lacked harmony, and nothing about her face lingered pleasantly in the mind. Still, she dressed with remarkable elegance, every detail chosen with care, and I found myself concluding that Wyatt's devotion must have been earned through qualities less visible and far more enduring. Intelligence, perhaps, depth of character, a presence felt rather than seen. She spoke very little, almost nothing, in fact, and within moments of boarding, she disappeared into her cabin alongside her husband, closing the door quietly behind them. That was when my old curiosity returned, stronger than before. There was no servant. That mystery had been resolved, which meant the extra cabin existed for only one other reason: baggage. I kept watch. After some delay, a cart finally rolled onto the wharf. Upon it rested a single object, a long, narrow pine box. There was nothing else. No trunks followed, no crates, just that one box. Almost immediately after it was brought aboard, the order was given to sail. Within the hour we had crossed the bar and were moving steadily into open water. The box drew my attention at once. I studied it carefully, perhaps too carefully. It was roughly 6 feet long and a little over 2 feet wide. The proportions were unmistakable, and the moment I recognized them, I congratulated myself on my own cleverness. Of course, paintings! I had suspected as much all along. Wyatt had been meeting regularly with Nicolino, the Italian dealer. I knew too that Nicolino possessed a celebrated copy of Leonardo's Last Supper, painted years earlier in Florence by Rubini the Younger. And now here was a container that could house nothing else in the world but a canvas of precisely those dimensions. The matter, I decided, was settled. I amused myself greatly with the thought. Wyatt, it seemed, intended to surprise me, perhaps even outwit me, by quietly transporting a masterpiece to New York right under my nose. It was the first time I could recall him keeping an artistic secret from me. I resolved then and there to tease him mercilessly once the opportunity arose. Yet one detail unsettled me. The box was not placed in the unused stateroom. Instead, it was carried directly into Wyatt's own cabin. There it remained, occupying nearly the entire floor. The arrangement struck me as wildly impractical, not to mention uncomfortable, particularly for a newly married couple. Worse still was the smell. The lettering on the box had been done in thick tar or paint, still pungent, releasing a sharp, nauseating odor that clung to the air and offended the senses. I noticed the inscription on the lid. Large, uneven letters declared, "Mrs. Adelaide Curtis, Albany, New York, in care of Cornelius Wyatt, Esquire. This side up. Handle with care." I read it twice. Something about those words, so formal, so deliberate, lingered unpleasantly in my thoughts, and for the first time since boarding the Independence, I felt a faint, unexplainable chill, as though the ship had carried aboard more than mere cargo. I knew, of course, that Mrs. Adelaide Curtis of Albany was the mother of Wyatt's wife. Still, the wording on the box struck me as deliberately misleading, almost theatrical. I convinced myself that the label was a kind of private joke, designed to confuse me and no one else. In my mind, the box would never travel beyond my friend's studio on Chambers Street once we reached New York. The first few days at sea passed quietly enough. The weather remained fair, though the wind blew stubbornly against us, shifting northward the moment the coastline disappeared from view. With nothing to occupy them but time, the passengers grew cheerful and eager for company. Conversations flourished. Laughter carried across the deck. With one notable exception. Wyatt and his sisters remained distant. Their manner toward the rest of the travelers was rigid, almost hostile. Wyatt's behavior I expected. His moods were famously dark, and now they seemed heavier than usual, bordering on outright bitterness. That, at least, was familiar. But his sisters unsettled me. They withdrew almost entirely into their cabins and declined every attempt at social interaction. No matter how politely I pressed them, they refused all engagement, as if determined to remain invisible for the duration of the voyage. With Mrs. Wyatt, on the other hand, she behaved quite differently. She was talkative, almost excessively so, and at sea, talkativeness is no small virtue. She quickly attached herself to the other ladies, moving easily among them, and to my genuine surprise, showed not the slightest inclination toward flirtation with the men. She entertained everyone. Or rather, she became a source of entertainment. It took little time for me to realize that she was more often laughed at than laughed with. The gentlemen, discreet as ever, said almost nothing. The women, however, reached a verdict among themselves with remarkable speed. They called her kind-hearted, plain, poorly educated, and undeniably vulgar. The true puzzle, they agreed, was how Wyatt, a man of refinement and taste, had come to marry her at all. Money was the obvious explanation. Yet I knew this theory to be false. Wyatt himself had told me plainly that she brought him nothing, not wealth, not prospects, not even expectations of future inheritance. "I married for love," he had said, "for love alone, and my wife is more than worthy of it." When I recalled these words spoken with such intensity, I felt a deep and uncomfortable confusion. Could it be possible that my friend was losing his reason? What other conclusion could I reach? Wyatt, so cultivated, so intellectually exacting, so painfully sensitive to flaws, and so profoundly attuned to beauty, seemed utterly misaligned with the woman who now bore his name. To be fair, she appeared passionately devoted to him, perhaps too passionately, especially in his absence.
She had an unfortunate habit of quoting her beloved husband, Mr. Wyatt, at every opportunity, repeating his remarks with theatrical reverence, an affection that only made her seem more absurd. And yet, beneath my judgment and doubt, a more troubling thought began to stir. If love alone truly bound them together, then what was it exactly that Wyatt saw and no one else could? The word husband seemed permanently lodged on her tongue, forever ready to spill out, as she herself might have phrased it. And yet the irony did not escape anyone on board. While she spoke of him incessantly, Wyatt appeared to avoid her with deliberate precision. He spent most of his time sealed inside his cabin, as if it were a refuge or a prison, rarely emerging and leaving his wife entirely free to occupy herself among the passengers in the main salon. From everything I witnessed, I drew an unfortunate conclusion. Some strange twist of fate, perhaps a moment of reckless passion or a lapse brought on by excessive romantic idealism, had driven the artist to bind himself to a woman entirely unsuited to him. And just as naturally, revulsion had followed, swift, complete. I pitied him deeply, truly I did. But pity did not entirely excuse his silence regarding the Last Supper. For that, I decided, I would have my revenge. One afternoon, Wyatt finally came up on deck. I took his arm, as I had so often done in years past, and we paced slowly along the rail. His gloom had not lifted in the slightest. If anything, it had settled deeper into him. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his words emerged with visible effort, as though dragged up from somewhere far below the surface. I attempted a few light remarks, even ventured a joke or two. He responded with what could only be described as an imitation of a smile, forced, fragile, and faintly unsettling. Poor man, I thought. Considering his domestic misery, it was remarkable that he could summon even that. That was when I resolved to begin. Carefully, gradually, I would let him know subtly that I was not entirely fooled by his little deception. I made an offhand comment about the unusual shape of that box. As I spoke, I smiled knowingly, added a conspiratorial wink, and gave him a gentle nudge in the ribs with my finger. What followed chilled me. At first, Wyatt simply stared, as though he could not grasp the meaning of my words. His expression was blank, vacant. Then, slowly, something seemed to register. His eyes widened, wider still. They appeared almost to bulge from their sockets. His face flushed a deep, unnatural red. Then, just as suddenly, it drained of all color. And then, he laughed. Not a quiet laugh, not even a nervous one. It was loud, explosive, wild. He threw his head back and roared with laughter, the sound echoing across the deck. I stood frozen as the outburst continued, growing louder, harsher, more frantic, minute after minute, as though fed by some unseen force. 10 minutes passed, perhaps more. Passengers stared. No one spoke. And then, without warning, his body gave way. He collapsed heavily onto the deck, striking it with a sickening finality. I rushed to him at once, but when I turned him over and felt his face, a dreadful thought seized me. To all appearances, Cornelius Wyatt was dead. I shouted for help. Several passengers rushed over, and with considerable effort we managed to revive him. When he finally came around, his speech was fractured and incoherent, a jumble of half-formed words that made little sense. Eventually he was bled, an old remedy hastily applied, and carried to his bed. By morning he appeared physically restored. As for his mind, I will say nothing. On the captain's advice, I avoided Wyatt for the remainder of the voyage. He shared my opinion entirely regarding the man's mental state, yet urged me, quite firmly, not to voice such suspicions to anyone else on board. It was agreed, silently, that discretion was safer than truth. Strangely enough, the incident only sharpened my curiosity.
Several details followed that disturbed me far more than the collapse itself. For reasons I can scarcely justify, my nerves were on edge. I drank far too much strong green tea and slept badly. In truth, on 2 separate nights, sleep never truly came at all. My cabin opened directly into the main dining area, as did those of the other unmarried men. Wyatt's cabins, 3 of them, were located in the after section of the ship, separated from the main cabin by a thin sliding door. That door was never locked, not even at night. We sailed close to the wind, and the breeze was often stiff. Whenever the ship leaned heavily to leeward, the sliding door would drift open on its own and remain that way, unattended. My own door, left open because of the heat, aligned perfectly with that opening. From my berth, I could see into the after cabin with unsettling clarity, directly toward the row of rooms belonging to Wyatt. And so, on 2 nights, separated by a day, I witnessed something I could not forget. Around 11 o'clock each night, I saw Mrs. Wyatt emerge quietly from her husband's cabin. Her movements were deliberate, careful. She glanced about as if fearing observation, then slipped into the unused stateroom, the extra one, and closed the door behind her. She remained there until dawn. At first light, Wyatt would call for her. She would return, as silently as she had left. The conclusion was unavoidable. They were living apart. Separate rooms, separate nights, a marriage already fractured, perhaps awaiting only a formal end. At last, I believed I had uncovered the purpose of the mysterious extra cabin. But that was not all. There was something else. On both sleepless nights, shortly after Mrs. Wyatt disappeared into the spare room, I became aware of faint sounds coming from her husband's cabin. They were subtle, deliberate, carefully restrained, as though whoever made them feared being overheard. I listened. At first, the noises seemed meaningless, soft movements, pauses, irregular rhythms. But as the minutes stretched on, I paid closer attention. Slowly, disturbingly, a pattern emerged, and then, at last, I understood exactly what those sounds were meant to convey. The sounds came in the dead of night, soft, deliberate, and unmistakably methodical. I realized with a mixture of fascination and dread that Wyatt was at work inside the oblong box. A chisel struck the wood, each tap muffled by something soft, a swath of wool or cotton wrapped around the mallet's head, deadening its blow. Still, the rhythm carried to my ears with haunting clarity. I could almost mark each motion, the moment he freed the lid, the careful removal of the top, the careful placement onto the lower berth. The lid made subtle, almost imperceptible knocks against the wooden edges as he lowered it gently. There was barely space to lay it down. Then came silence, absolute, except perhaps for a faint sound, a suppressed sigh or murmur, so delicate it might have been nothing but a trick of my imagination or a ringing in my own ears. I told myself it was nonsense. Wyatt, for all his quirks, was simply indulging one of his passionate artistic moods. He had opened the box to gaze upon the treasure inside. There was no reason for tears, no reason for whispers. It had to be my nerves playing tricks, stirred up by too much green tea and too little sleep. Yet I could not ignore the pattern. Just before dawn on both nights, I heard him replace the lid, hammering the nails carefully back into place with the muffled mallet. Then he would step out, fully dressed, and quietly summon Mrs. Wyatt from her cabin. The routine was methodical, ritualistic, and chilling in its precision. By the 7th day, we were off Cape Hatteras. The sea had grown restless, and the sky hung low with threatening clouds. And then, with little warning, a tremendous blow struck from the southwest. The ship shuddered under the weight of the wind, a deep groan rolling through her timbers.
We had seen hints of the storm building, had made preparations aloft and below, but nothing could soften the force that now bore down upon us. Lines were tightened, sails double-reefed, the spanker and foretopsail held firm, but the Independence heeled sharply, pitching as the waves hit her side. The Oblong Box, silent and foreboding, rested in Wyatt's cabin, an ominous presence amid the chaos, and I could not shake the feeling that the storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest that awaited within those narrow walls. For 2 full days the Independence rode the swells with relative calm. She proved herself a sturdy vessel, taking the waves like a seasoned mariner, and little water found its way below. But calm seas are rarely permanent at sea, and on the 3rd day the wind grew fierce, twisting into a hurricane. The aftersail shredded into tatters, leaving the ship pitching violently in the troughs. Waves crashed over her decks one after another, relentless and unyielding. Disaster struck swiftly. 3 men were washed overboard along with the caboose, and nearly the entire larboard bulwarks were torn away. Before we could even grasp the magnitude of our misfortune, the foretopsail split into shreds. In desperation, we raised a storm staysail, and for a few hours it kept the ship pointing more steadily into the monstrous seas, but the hurricane would not relent. The rigging, poorly fitted and under tremendous strain, groaned with every heave. By the 3rd day, around 5 in the afternoon, the mizzenmast gave way entirely, snapping under the force of the wind and tumbling into the water. We struggled for over an hour to clear the wreckage, rolling violently with each wave, until the carpenter's voice called out, 4 feet of water in the hold. The pumps were nearly useless, choked with debris, and the leak gained on us rapidly. Chaos reigned. Desperation colored every action. We fought to lighten the ship, throwing cargo overboard and cutting away the remaining masts. The efforts barely kept us afloat. Still, the water crept higher, a silent, inevitable enemy.
As the sun sank, the gale slackened slightly, and with it the waves subsided just enough to offer a glimmer of hope. By 8 in the evening, the clouds parted to the windward, revealing a full moon. Its pale light glimmered across the troubled waters, a fragile comfort to our weary spirits. Through incredible effort, the longboat was finally lowered and secured. Into it we crowded the crew and most of the passengers, and they rowed toward safety, enduring misery and exhaustion, until 3 days later they finally reached Ocracoke Inlet. But 14 passengers, including the captain, remained aboard. They resolved to place their faith in the jolly boat at the stern. We lowered it cautiously. It threatened to capsize immediately, teetering as it touched the water, but by sheer luck it held. Inside were the captain and his wife, Mr. Wyatt and his party, a Mexican officer and his wife with 4 children, myself, and a single Negro valet. Packed together like sardines, we pushed off into the open sea, the night stretching endlessly before us, the storm still whispering threats across the waves. We had no room for anything beyond the bare necessities, just a few essential tools, some provisions, and the clothes we wore. Nothing else had been spared, nothing else thought worth saving. So imagine the astonishment of everyone in the boat when, barely a few fathoms from the wreck, Wyatt stood up in the stern sheets, calmly, deliberately, and demanded that Captain Hardy put back, for what? For his oblong box. "Sit down, Mr. Wyatt," the captain barked, his tone sharp. "You'll capsize us if you don't remain still. Our gunwale is almost in the water." "The box!" Wyatt shouted, his voice rising above the roar of the sea. "The box, I say. Captain Hardy, you cannot, you will not refuse me. Its weight is nothing, a trifle. By the mother who bore you,
by the hope of salvation, I implore you, put back for the box." For a fleeting moment, the captain hesitated, as though Wyatt's wild insistence had touched him. Then his stern composure returned. "Mr. Wyatt, you are mad. I cannot listen. Sit down, I say, or you will swamp the boat. Stay, hold him, seize him. He's about to spring overboard. There, I knew it. He is over." And with that, Wyatt did exactly as warned. He leapt from the boat. By a feat of almost superhuman strength, he caught a rope dangling from the forechains, clinging like a man possessed. In the next instant, he was on board the wreck, rushing frantically into the cabin. Meanwhile, we were swept away, astern of the ship, fully exposed to the monstrous waves. Our small boat was helpless, a feather tossed by the tempest. The doom of the artist was apparent to every eye. Then we saw him. Emerging from the companionway, he literally dragged the oblong box behind him. Every movement was Herculean, unnatural, driven by a force no sane mind could muster. We could scarcely believe what we saw as he looped a thick 3-inch rope around the box and then around his own body. In a single, horrifying instant, both man and box plunged into the raging sea. Gone. Instantly, irrevocably. For a long while, we lingered on our oars, staring at the spot where they had vanished, the wind and waves roaring in our ears. Not a word was spoken. The silence was almost unbearable. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, I dared to break it with a single trembling remark.
"Did you notice," I said softly, "how suddenly they sank? Was it not unnaturally swift? For a moment, only a moment, I dared to hope he might yet be saved when I saw him bind himself to the box and surrender to the sea." "They sank as they were meant to," the captain replied coldly. "Straight down, like a shot. They will rise again in time, but not until the salt has dissolved." "The salt?" I exclaimed. "Hush," the captain warned, gesturing toward the wife and sisters of the deceased. "Such matters must wait for a more fitting hour. We endured unspeakable hardship and escaped death by the narrowest margin. After 4 days of relentless misery, more dead than alive, we were cast ashore on the beach opposite Roanoke Island. We remained there for a week, treated with tolerable humanity by the wreckers, and eventually secured passage to New York. Nearly a month after the loss of the Independence, I encountered Captain Hardy by chance on Broadway. Our conversation turned, inevitably, to the disaster, and most especially to the tragic fate of poor Wyatt. From him, I learned the dreadful truth. Wyatt had booked passage for himself, his wife, her 2 sisters, and a servant. His wife was, indeed, as beautiful and accomplished as rumor had claimed. But on the morning of June 14th, the very day I first visited the ship, she was seized by sudden illness and died. The young husband was driven nearly mad with grief, yet circumstances made delay impossible. The body of her beloved wife had to be delivered to her mother in New York. At the same time, Wyatt knew well the universal horror such a revelation would provoke. Most passengers would rather abandon the voyage than sail alongside a corpse. Thus, a desperate solution was devised. The body was partially embalmed and packed in a box of suitable dimensions, layered with a heavy quantity of salt. It was shipped aboard as ordinary merchandise. Not a word was to be spoken of the lady's death. Since it was widely known that Wyatt had booked passage for his wife, someone had to appear in her place. This role fell to the lady's maid, who was easily persuaded. The extra stateroom, originally intended for her during her mistress's life, was retained. There, the false wife slept each night. By day, she performed her part as convincingly as she could. The real woman's face it had been carefully confirmed, was known to none of the passengers.
My own terrible misunderstanding arose from a temperament too curious, too careless, too quick to imagine horrors where truth already lay concealed. And yet, since that time, I rarely sleep in peace. There is a face that follows me wherever I turn. There is a shrill, hysterical laugh that will echo in my ears forever.
And thus the story ended. If you liked this journey into the worlds of classic literature, do not forget to support us by subscribing so we can tell you more. And hey, if there's a classic tale you'd love to hear told in this suspenseful style, drop its name in the comments below. Your suggestion might be our next chilling adventure.